Well, thank you, everyone. And, we thought it'd be great to have just more of a casual discussion after the wonderful talk that Jim had provided on MedTech ecosystem and building the ecosystem. So maybe, Frank, do you want to kind of start us off here and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Frank Jaskulke. I'm now at Avio MedTech Consulting, a group that works with and creates startup medical device companies. But before that, I had the good joy of spending 20 years at the Medical Alley Association, supporting and partnering with this incredible ecosystem, working on efforts like MedTech 3.0, partnering with Hubert and Mayo Clinic and others. And I'm really excited to have this conversation for two reasons. So one, in boardrooms and legislatures in Minnesota and all around the U.S., there's hand-wringing about competitiveness, right? No matter how good things are going, the grass is always greener somewhere else. We heard from the last question about Massachusetts. Fun fact, Boston Scientific has more people in Minnesota than Massachusetts has its an entire device industry. So there's this perception of decline, real or maybe just perceived, but there's also a lot of change happening, and I fundamentally believe that you all, whether you're in Minnesota or you're in South Dakota or somewhere else, you're going to drive the change, and what we want to do today is have a bit of a conversation of what different places are doing in order to create stronger innovation ecosystems, and then why. Because, right, for whatever community or ecosystem we're trying to build, the what we do should be tied to why we need it, what problems we are trying to solve, and we believe we can learn from each other where we all have different problems, different conditions, and thus need different solutions. So Hubert and I are going to moderate a discussion with this great group. We'll take your questions, and hopefully by the end of this, you all will have some better insights on how you might accelerate change, whether it's here in Minnesota or in whatever community you represent, for one fundamental reason, the thing that we can all agree on. I always come back to the Mayo Clinic model that the needs of the patient come first. That's the part that connects us all to this. I don't know if Hubert, anything you want to add?
Yeah, that was wonderful, Frank. And I'll just add on that too, is just we're going to challenge the panelists a little bit too in terms of thinking about creative ways, because just because there is competition and there are different ecosystems building up, are there creative ways that we could all kind of work together, collaborate, pros and cons of that, reality of that. And also, I think many of us in this room too have done startups, and it's hard. And you kind of wonder, you go through these different ecosystems and you wonder, like, is this as easy as it gets? Because it's really hard. And are we missing something to help a lot of these entrepreneurs? Can we do better? Are we needing to, in these creative ways, to better support these entrepreneurs? Or is it just we are doing great and that's reality and it's just that difficult? And that's good to know too, because then you can go home and cry a little bit and then try again afterwards, right? So we're going to kind of challenge some questions here and then open it to the audience. So maybe with that, we could introduce each of the panelists. You want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm Mickayla, Rosard, partner at Groove Capital. We are a early stage venture fund focused on Minnesota companies. And then we also have a angel network that follows along to investing along the side of the fund. In addition to that, I'm also working with Greater MSP and Forge North on building a more robust angel community here in Minnesota. Prior to my kind of current roles at both those posts, previously worked at the Department of Homeland Security Center for Innovation, kind of pairing together big industry sectors and the government, as well as a federal financing program to help foreign investors invest in U.S. companies. So my career is kind of equal parts innovation, kind of ecosystem building, as well as securing investments.
Great, thank you, Mickayla.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eddie Pauline, and serve as president and CEO of the Ohio Life Sciences Association. We're the industry association for life sciences in Ohio, similar to Medical Alley here, I suppose. We work to grow the market in Ohio to ensure that Ohio can be a place where companies can grow and thrive and bring more life-saving technology to patients. Prior to that, I served as Director of Economic Development at the Ohio State University.
Morning, everyone. I'm Mudit Jain.
Was that a boo?
I graduated from Michigan. It's complicated, the Big Ten, you know. I'm from I went to Michigan, so.
Mudit Jain, general partner at Treo Ventures. So we are a medical device dedicated venture fund based out of California and Nevada. $100 million, $80 million fund. Actually, bulk of our investments are in Minnesota. 70% of my portfolio is Minnesota. And all medical devices. On top of being an investor, I also am a founder of 3 companies here in Minnesota. 3 companies in neuromodulation space that have raised $170 million over the last 4 years. My background is I kind of worked and lived here for a while and working with Guidant in the cardiac rhythm management business. Then actually went to work with J&J in the venture fund before moving on to the private venture side. Companies like Inspire, CVRX, I'll talk a little bit more about that. What have they done to the ecosystem? Because the cultural aspect to taking risk. And when successes happen, it drives that and reinforces that system. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. My education is I'm undergrad in electrical engineering from India and then did my PhD in biomedical engineering and got an MBA in healthcare and finance.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joni Ekstrum, the Executive Director of South Dakota Biotech. Much like Eddie and Frank, when you're at the Medical Alley, we're the state affiliate of National Bio. So we have around 60 members in South Dakota that we are trying to grow and help figure out their way. I think we'll talk about a little bit about that as we move forward. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you guys and being here with my state counterparts to hear what's going on. Jim, that's fantastic what you have going on. Honestly, like, grass is not greener, but it is kind of what you guys have. So I'm anxious to dive into that a little bit, but I'm happy to be here, part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Schad. I'm from Rochester, Minnesota, so the southern anchor of the Minnesota ecosystem, I think I would say, in healthcare technology. I'm with Mayo Clinic and Destination Medical Center Economic Development Agency, so I'm really with 2 organizations employed by Mayo. I've been seconded over or loaned out to this economic development agency. In my role, I'm a team of people that are building an innovation district called Discovery Square, a place for technology companies to partner with Mayo and others to take their technologies to market. 10 years ago, the innovation district did not exist. We're getting good traction. We've got 50 or so healthcare technology companies growing in Rochester. My specific role now is to develop and grow the supportive ecosystem so that those companies have access to the sort of resources that they need. My background, I've got a degree in biology. I've worked at Mayo Clinic for a long time. My role evolved. I've probably had 4 or 5 careers at Mayo. Most recently, it was leading strategic alliances and partnerships with other institutions. So I speak Mayo Clinic, which kind of helps in that translation to working with other organizations outside of Mayo.
Thank you so much, Chris. So with that, maybe we'll start off.
Yeah. And I'm thinking maybe the first place we start the discussion, we're talking about ecosystem. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I think, Jim, you did a good job of setting up like the way we're thinking about it for the MedTech 3.0 strategy. But I wanted, Chris, this is your job. I wanted to ask you if you would start with just like define what is it that we're talking about when we say ecosystem?
So there's a lot of ways to define it. The way that we have chosen to define it in the work that we're doing in Rochester and perhaps across the state, we've identified 6 nodes, if you will, in the ecosystem. And it starts with the businesses themselves, the innovators in the businesses, and understanding what they need. The source, the second one would be the source of the IP, which would be the clinical and research organizations. And like every ecosystem is probably going to have some version of all of these nodes, I should say. So you've got the businesses, you've got the source of the IP, which is the clinical and research organizations that are like innovating on technologies and identifying needs and trying to find ways to fill those needs. You've got capital is necessary, of course. You need higher ed institutions for workforce. You need service providers, the kinds of companies that can provide the services that aren't baked within the companies, so in the regulatory and reimbursement space. And you need economic development organizations that know how to find companies, find technologies, and make the case that this is where we are going to land. So we try to focus on those nodes. We're spending a lot more time focusing on the businesses and capital and workforce. That's where we're finding we spend a lot of time. The service industry is really robust here, the service providers. It's really well established here in Minnesota, and we feel like there's a lot we can tap into, but we have some work to do for sure in capital and in workforce.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I can, oh, good, yeah.
Mudit, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to
Go
add,
ahead,
I
yes,
think
please.
one important element which, having lived and sort of experienced Minnesota culture as well, over the last 25 years, it's the successes that ultimately drive that risk-taking.
Yeah.
And that cultural aspect,
Yeah.
25 years ago, everybody wanted to be in the big companies. It was very difficult to recruit people out of those.
Right.
And now I think, Jim, you talked about the alumni talent pool. I mean, Inspire is an amazing success story there, isn't it? And I can't tell you how easy it has become for us to recruit from Medtronic now and Boston. So there's a cultural aspect to it, which we kind of is the softer part of
Yeah.
it, but a very critical aspect
Yeah, that's
to that
Yeah,
ecosystem.
Yeah, 100%.
And I might ask, like, Eddie and Joni, if you'd comment on that of, are there things as you think about your ecosystems that you would add, or, and this will lead into the second question we'll ask of everyone, are there components that you think are more or less critical, right? Like everything matters, but what are those foundational pieces in your view?
Sure, I can add a few thoughts to that. I think at least in the case of Ohio, we think a lot about talent, space, and funding. Do our startups emerging from our institutions have the right place to grow in? When they spin out, is it easy to find people and capital? And if it's not, they chase that elsewhere. So making sure that we as an organization, our state is always thinking about funding the appropriate growth mechanisms for companies has become really important. Collaboration, the question about collaboration, I think, is really interesting. I think successful ecosystems have some reasons, some incentives to collaborate. In Ohio, it's complex. We've got three sort of tier one cities, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. They compete against each other. The anchor institutions within those cities, places like Ohio State, Nationwide Children's Hospital, Cleveland Clinic, University Hospital, Cincinnati Children's. There's examples, or there's situations where I'm not sure any one of them would be terribly upset if the other one went out of business. So how do you get these mammoth institutions to really eagerly collaborate? What is the real incentive for them to do that? If that's unclear, then that remains hard. So in Ohio, what we've tried to do, and this has been really led by our privatized economic development group called Jobs Ohio, which is a pretty unique setup. Jobs Ohio is a private corporation that handles all of our economic development. It's funded by state liquor sales. They get all the revenue from our state liquor, and then they use that to create economic incentives for new companies coming to town.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's last.
Can we do that in Minnesota?
Yeah.
Is that going to work?
Yeah.
That's incentivizing innovation.
Fiscal year '24, their revenue was $1.7 billion. So it's a great source of capital.
It's a great problem to have.
It's the football season. Football season. That's what I'm going to say.
Before or after Michigan?
Yeah, liquor only, no beer and wine. But what that organization has done in the last few years is it's seeded 3 innovation districts in each of those cities I mentioned with a $100 million fund, or $100 million incentive, so $300 million total. And that was trying to incentivize the institutions in those 3 innovation districts to collaborate together. What we've also done is we've branded something called the Ohio Discovery Corridor, ensuring that people, when we go to market as Ohio, we avoid going to market as 3 individual cities. So previously it was Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus competing with one another to win new expansion opportunities. With the Ohio Discovery Corridor, we're trying to go to market as one state and again, to compete more with regions that are presenting themselves as more collaborative. RTP, Maryland area, others that do a better job of sort of positioning themselves as a region. So I think the incentive to collaborate, the brand, is allowing us to build an overall stronger ecosystem, not only in the three major cities in Ohio, but as an entire state as well.
I think the incentive thing is going to be important, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But yeah, maybe Joni, do you want to talk about what you're...
Well, Eddie and I have the fun job of wrangling all of these people to try to collaborate as a trade association, because they're all our members. And let me tell you, they are competitive, and I get that, right? Everyone needs funding in our state. The universities are competing for funding, and there's not a lot of it. So we're a low-tax state, which is great for most things, except there's not a lot of money to spend on things, right? So we're trying to figure out what works with that. But I think it's important. This is an important conversation. How can we as a region really pull our strengths together? I know in South Dakota we have many strengths, but one of which is we keep talking about is one of our universities, Dakota State University, is a really strong top university in the nation for cybersecurity, and they're trying to build that out with AI and quantum computing and things like that. So I see that as a strength of ours in our state, and how can we use that expertise and leverage it with what you have going on here in Minnesota. I think there's some interesting conversations with that. Bioprocessing is another area of which we feel we're strong in. Our state has invested in some facilities at our research parks to really help pilot some of those early stage companies. So I don't have much more to add to the conversations except for that it's really interesting to have these conversations, and really I hope we can continue these conversations and see what makes sense. How can we help you guys grow? What can we do to make sure that you guys are getting what you need by leveraging our strengths to help with the region? So,
and I think like all of you I think it illustrated a really important thing, that you heard different contexts that they're all operating in are driving different solutions. Right, if you have $1 billion of liquor sales revenue that you can use to fund an activity, that's a very different thing. Our equivalent in Minnesota, DEED, has a grand total budget of about $30 million, and that covers every industry for the entire state and the unemployment side, right? So like very different contexts drive different activities. We might learn from those contexts to make different decisions. And I might ask, just before we go to the next question, how does that play out, like what you've heard, how does it play out on as you're trying to build the investor networks? Because I think that is another part of the ecosystem, the individual people that you're trying to bring together and get them to take action.
Yeah, so capital in all of this is really important, although I know we're not supposed to emphasize that on this panel. I think to boil everything down, it's really important when you're talking about ecosystem, like there's 3 key parties that have to come together. It's nonprofit, it's corporations or public sector, and then it's the private sector or government as well. In a lot of the folks, like circles that I'm in, just in VC, I think we love to like downplay government's role in creating really robust ecosystems. But truly, I cannot think of one ecosystem that doesn't have all 3 of those pieces coming together in a really fundamental core way. And don't get me wrong, that's the kind of table stakes, and what we're gonna like pull on in this conversation are all of the other pieces that can help foster. But even if you look back at kind of the history of Silicon Valley, like everyone loves to use this as the gold standard of what an ecosystem should look like. Silicon Valley got started at its core because of really early access to DARPA's internet. And so it's only with some of that government participation that it's able to foster such a robust ecosystem. So I think for bringing more investors to the table, it's making sure that they understand how government can de-risk some of those investments, how the nonprofit and university systems can really be drivers of talent and innovation as well, and really making sure that there's a pulse on kind of every piece of what that ecosystem is looking like.
So if I could just double click on that for just a moment, because like if I look at what's happening with Rochester and the state investment in Rochester as an example, So if you're not aware, 2013, the state of Minnesota made a 20-year, $600 million commitment to the city of Rochester for infrastructure. So you have a very strong partner in the state. And the sort of the key components is it's a long play. It's 20 years. It's not a 2-year election cycle or a 4-year election cycle. It's a substantial amount of money, and it has key performance indicators that we're being held accountable to every single year. But it requires private industry, in our case, it's Mayo Clinic. It requires the public investment from the state of Minnesota, and it requires the city of Minnesota, or the city of Rochester, right? So that public-private partnership at that scale, it's proving out. We're in year 11 of a 20-year thing, and we're hitting the mark. But as a model where you're requiring that public investment, public engagement, and private industry, those are sort of the things that have been making it work, and I think those are key elements in the future.
And so let's kind of challenge the situation here a bit. Let's say you can be successful. You have this government investment, the state investment, public-private collaborations. How do we know that it's actually working well? We have a lot of metrics at the university. We have a lot of metrics. Everywhere has metrics. There's so many metrics. I don't know what are metrics. But what are the real metrics? What really tells us that you invest all this money, you have all these regions building up, and that we're actually doing good, and we are helping the ecosystem. So maybe, Mudit, you can start off. We had some conversations with other regions, like Ireland, too. And then, Mickayla, you can chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, every stakeholder has a little bit different take on it, isn't it? So economic development is direct jobs, indirect jobs, and the multipliers there. Right. How much out-of-state capital you're leveraging. It's not just what the state or local entity is putting in, but how much additional capital. I mean, I'll give you a good example. Of the 9 companies I've invested in Minnesota, I've had local investment from 2 investors in those companies, in 2 of those companies. All of it has been coastal, all of it, including Inspire, which just has been a phenomenal story, but none of the local investors ever invested. So somehow I think, Jim, you talked about it. There's a little bit of this coastal validation, and I'm deviating from your topic about the metrics.
This is good.
But partially, to me as an investor, ultimately the metrics is around success, isn't it? That's how I get measured. People get measured differently. So I get measured on how much capital I return, and that's purely on the financial terms. Yeah. Having said that, companies that fail also generate people, talent, skill sets that are recycled. But if you don't have success, then that starts to die out. Again, I can't tell you the impact and difference I've seen in Minnesota post-Inspire versus pre-Inspire.
I see.
I mean, having been a guide myself, I was being recruited by some startups. I was like, I ended up going to J&J. And then coming out in the system, you get a taste of the success of the private system outside of this. It is mind-boggling. So to me, it's, again, cultural fit, cultural risk-taking. All of that becomes very important. It's tough to quantify the cultural aspect. I mean, again, California, for all its doom and gloom, just became the 4th largest economy. 7.5% growth in that economy that's beating China, Japan, everybody, overall U.S. And you go, what's the big difference there? Government doesn't help you. I can tell you. I was in Silicon Valley. I just recently moved to Nevada. Government doesn't help you. They push you out. And still they're growing like that. And it's still the ecosystem because there's something about the risk-taking. It's the gold rush. Once you taste blood, you want more of it. And it's the gold rush. It truly is that. It's the gold rush that drives, it's the hunger that drives people. And that's a cultural thing.
Yeah, but kind of pulling on that a bit more, and Frank, you chime in too, is then are we kind of saying, I mean, we could do all this ecosystem building, but it comes down to 1, 2, 3 major events that need to happen that then cause kind of a domino effect and enable, like you're talking about Inspire before and after.
And there's other companies too. Don't get me wrong.
And government investment too, right? Like if you think about the internet, there's some catalyst. But it's got to be big enough that then causes everything to kind of... Medtronic is the prime example. And we had Medtronic, right?
I'm hearing, like, from what you just shared,
Yeah.
maybe two initial metrics that I'd call, like one is coastal validation, right? If you can attract top name investors from, say, Silicon Valley, that's probably a check in your favor, right?
And I've never been a top name investor. That's the other line, besides J&J, but I've had really good returns and so forth.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and then the second being wins. And I think this is actually really well said and applicable for all of us, right? Like, we are 75 years later still benefiting from Medtronic started here. I mean, I always pick on Ohio because I went to the University of Minnesota, but like, if Earl Bakken had been born in Cleveland, that would be the medical device capital. It was that simple. The return on luck, and I'm totally with you, Inspire was sort of another generation of that, created that next like wave. So I think two metrics we're maybe hearing is coastal validation and then wins, right? Outcomes drive further outcomes.
Yeah. I would add, in our case in Ohio, I think, new company creation is really important. Again, keeping Ohio IP in Ohio is a big deal. An exit, a large exit, and then having those leaders stay loyal to the state and start new things. We had a great example in a company called Cover My Meds. It was founded in Columbus, purchased by McKesson for over $1 billion, so unicorn type level. We had a meeting about a year ago with a group of digital health leaders. I think there were about 12 of them in the room. 8 of them had previously worked at Cover My Meds. So that flywheel effect really was starting to take place because a founder had an exit and stayed loyal to the state. So it's a big deal. On the IP side, Nationwide Children's Hospital created 2 of the first 8 FDA-approved gene therapies. 1 left, chased some money in Chicago. It was the Avexis, which created Zolgensma for SMA. The DMD, Duchenne muscular dystrophy treatment, stayed local, and it was purchased by Sarepta Therapeutics. Sarepta, again, Boston-based biotech, moved its entire R&D center of excellence to Columbus because of that acquisition. So again, good science, new company creation, kind of some of these basics, I think are good metrics to pay attention to.
I'm going to pull on one thread. So you mentioned big exits, and I absolutely agree in a general sense, like that creates a lot of energy in an ecosystem. One thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, but also maybe kind of preparing our ecosystem, because we have such a robust device and healthcare infrastructure, a lot of those early stage investments are going to probably be purchased or acquired before they get to that $1 billion level. And it's still a healthy sign of an ecosystem, but we don't have that particular metric. And I don't know that we're going to have a lot of those metrics. So I've been trying to kind of shift a little bit of the expectations around that being an indicator of success in the ecosystem, at least for this particular industry. And that doesn't mean that investors won't make money, and it doesn't mean that founders can't be really successful and go on to create another company. But I do think sometimes, especially in kind of the startup ecosystem and venture, we just hang our hat on the unicorn, and that's kind of the marker of success. So I've been challenging people to kind of think differently about that. And one of the ways in which I've kind of shifted that, trying to shift that thinking, is more so like the metric of success is the time to value. Like, how much time does it take to get from a idea to prototyping to commercialization to like revenue and value creation? If that's a really condensed timeline, you've got a healthy ecosystem. So even if you're kicking out some really great exits but aren't at that $1 billion marker, it can still be a really healthy sign. And the other thing that I would add from a metrics perspective that I think is important, we've kind of touched on it, is just in general feedback loops. So like the most healthy ecosystems have some awesome feedback loops, whether it's the flywheel of the successful founder, staying in the market, providing expertise, whether those feedback loops are coming from industry, kind of giving the information and kind of where the industries are going to small businesses to fill some of those gaps in kind of the market. But I do think feedback loops is a really important sign of an ecosystem. And when you're in an ecosystem without proper feedback loops, you can feel it.
I agree. You know, I think we talked a bit about how do we tell our story. We were this Midwest Nice group. So I think finding those, not just the unicorns, I think is really important because they are part of the ecosystem that we have in each of our states and certainly part of the region. So I agree with you, finding those successes, even though they might not be like the billion-dollar exits, but it's really part of that whole conversation to attract investors to pay attention that there is some sort of a cluster maybe happening here in this region, and how do we pool together our metrics so that we can have a larger conversation, I think is really important.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I totally agree with that. But I think one of the, and this is one of the, challenges that economic development authorities have, there's opportunities which I call product and license opportunities, which can be great for an entrepreneur, where with little capital you can have a decent exit and you can move on to your next project. But let's differentiate between those and sort of venture-backed companies, because I think the false narrative becomes that everything has to be venture-backed company. And then the expectations are different because now the VCs like me are coming in and we have a different viewpoint. But there's a lot of great opportunities that can be built to buy quick exits for an entrepreneur. They do a lot better financially in those, and then they have the financial freedom to go and start the next thing. So that is also a backbone of that ecosystem, not to discount that as a particular aspect.
Yeah, I think maybe there's an element of that, like what we see with our Mayo inventors is they're passionate about their role as a healthcare provider. They're coming up with the innovation. They don't know how to run a business, but they want to get the technology out into the market. So for that individual, their exit is handing it off to a management team, right? And so that's a down in the weeds kind of metric, but because then that allows them to cycle back in, come up with the next innovation, right? So they're not taking the technology forward, but they're handing it off to somebody who knows how to take the technology forward. And you need that expertise to be able to be that management team that they can hand it off to.
And I think just to add to that, maybe just to summarize too, is the ability then to hand off, but to what you're saying, Mickayla, is that the time that it takes, and that shorter timeline, shorter cost. But then, Mudit, you had mentioned something, comment subtly, is even if it fails though, then you have these other offsprings, right, that come from that. And I think the learnings from that too. So capturing like each of these pieces. Of course, I still like the big win because then we kind of everybody can get around it, rally around it.
Yeah, and Hubert, like we talked about yesterday, I think one additional element is a increasing density of companies that are maybe bringing in between $10 and $50 million in revenue. Here are real companies selling their med tech devices to customers in the state or beyond. Are they here? Do they have a facility? Are they creating jobs? Do they have the agency to make decisions? That will also, I think, attract capital and kind of counter the, it's all about, more venture dollars into the state to support startups. You do at some point need a functioning business community that has the decision to invest further in the community. Like one issue we have in Ohio is we've had a boon of like big pharma biomanufacturing opportunities coming to the state, which is great, creating a lot of jobs, big investment, but those sites end up not having the type of agency or decision-making they need to further invest in the state. They're kind of there making their product, but the decision makers are still somewhere on the coast. And, it's very different to not have a headquarters associated with that facility in the state.
That maybe is also a really good call out of a metric of like, we think about like being a headquartered state, but being a community in which the decision makers are involved and engaged and are present versus, right, simply like Jim, you had mentioned to everyone, they ask Medtronic for a factory. Well, you can build a factory and then the factory might close and that decision is made 1,000 miles away. I think that's another good highlight. I wanted to ask, Joni, you had mentioned the cybersecurity thing, which made me think, especially because we have a significant university audience here, how do you think about metrics or how things are working when you're working on new technologies that may be years from even coming out of the university, or training of people that are going to go work, but where the distance between what you're doing and where you'll see the impact may be significant. Like, how do you keep the community motivated? How do you keep the legislature motivated to sustain that sort of effort?
I wish I knew exactly.
Fair.
In our state, it's continual conversation, and how do we get legislators and decision makers to fund these projects, and to really look at what it is that we're strong at and leveraging that, and not be ashamed of we don't have a big, huge pharmaceutical environment, but that's okay, right? We have some great things that we're doing, and how do we focus on those things and really tie into and lean into those strengths that we have. So for us, I don't know exactly that, except we do have a new science and tech plan, a 2030 science and tech plan that we are now taking to leverage to our lawmakers. I'm sure you've heard in our state, we do have a new governor that wasn't elected. Governor Nome is now in DC. So it's been an interesting, at least for us, conversation to educate the new governor, find out who his priorities are. And I'm spending far more time on advocacy than I wish I had to these days, both in DC and in the state. And we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but I do think that's important conversation. And that's why, for me, communication and how do we tell the story. So I love the conversation that we just had on the metrics, is to really be proud of what we've got and really lean into those things. And why should we invest in them? Why should the universities and the state be investing in this type of activity? And what are we strong at? Where should we build at? And not compete, and let's find ways to collaborate. So those are conversations we're having ongoing. I would love to hear what you guys are. I'm taking notes, by the way, of all the stuff. These aren't for me. I'm like, these guys are doing this great stuff, right? So I want to be able to take some of this back. So I'd love to hear what you guys also think, other panelists.
Well, just one more thing to add. I think we talked about retaining the talent. We didn't talk about attracting talent from outside. That is a very important metrics. I mean, good companies and good systems will not only retain the talent here, but they'll attract out-of-state capital as well, out-of-state human capital and human talent, which is extremely important.
Yeah.
So ability to recruit, like some of the companies that are based here of ours, one of the CEOs is coming from Atlanta. Another one, we relocated from California. So that's the strength of the ecosystem here, that we can attract talent from out of state. Because you're not going to find all the talent here. As big a talent pool as we have in MedTech in Minnesota, you're not going to find all of it here. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very important matrix. Can we attract talent from outside?
And I think for us in Minnesota, we have to be exceptionally amazing and creative, because we lose out to the coast and San Diego and the beaches.
Do we? I don't know. Do we?
Yeah, a lot of challenges, yeah. But, even recruiting like universities, I would say for us, like neuroengineering, I would claim, and you'll see the conference, tomorrow and Friday, I would say we're one of the best in the world. But we'll still lose out to Utah because they're going skiing over there, and then San Diego because the weather's nice. But I do think we can bring in talent as a good indicator, and the question is, how do we do that in addition to being great, right, and attracting them? So there's going to be some interesting.
In spite of the weather, I think we have been able to bring talent here.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
You do need, to your question, your comments about state leadership, you need state leadership that's willing to look beyond their term, right? So think about what's happened in Massachusetts. There have been, I think, 3 different governors who have successively continued the investment in the life sciences industry in Massachusetts. 3 different administrations. It wasn't one and then the next one dropped it. So that long-term vision and that long-term play, it's a long play. And where there is public investment, it requires the political will to make a long-term commitment.
Yeah, Chris, that's a huge point. And I think if you look at all the states that maybe we'd consider winning in this industry, at some point in their past, they've had an executive champion at the highest level of government pushing an agenda that's focused on transformational investment specifically in this industry.
Yeah.
And
Beyond their own administration.
exactly, yeah, multi-year, multi-decade type investments. Yep.
What I heard is we as a nation are doomed. Consistency.
But we can do it here in Minnesota.
Well, how do we convince it that everywhere else in the nation is doomed? Well, in Ohio too, and every other state.
It is like a good point of that tension of, on one hand, we're trying to sell like the sky is falling, we need to invest or we're gonna die. And then on the other hand, like go to the people and go, no, it's okay, like keep doing stuff. Like you should invest here because things are good. That tension is a real pressure we all face.
I just last week I was at the state, crying about the lack of investment that Ohio has in the life sciences, pointing out, Pennsylvania, Governor Shapiro just invested about $40 million of his budget directly into biotech to set up a clinical trial network and workforce programs and matching funds for venture. Andy Bashir in Kentucky just funded a $15 million wet lab incubator. And I said, Ohio is surrounded by states that are positioning themselves to sort of eat our lunch. Meanwhile, Amgen just invested $900 million in Ohio. So they're like, well, what are you talking about? What's the problem? So it is. It's a really delicate dance of, the reality of short-term thinking politicians and a longer-term health of an ecosystem play.
I would like to say, I think what Jim, you're doing here with having a strategy and including the state, involving them in getting buy-in from them is really important. And I don't think we should lose sight of how important industry is for this. And so what you guys have here, and to Mudit's point of attracting talent, like it's important. Kids want to know. Kids these days, kids have told me I'm not supposed to say it. Students, my apologies, want to know where they can collaborate with industry. They want to know where they can work. They want to be able to have those experiences that you guys have here in Minneapolis and not all regions have. So I think having this 3.0 with state buy-in is really, really important, and including industry in those conversations is incredibly important as well.
Kind of on all these topics, I think an intriguing one, and Mudit, you and I chatted about it, and I want to hear all of your thoughts on this, is we're talking about, recruiting talent, investment in governments, and, I lived in Ireland for a year and a half because one of the companies I'm involved with, we had lots of support from the government, a lot of good talent, and I moved my family there on sabbatical leave, here for a year and a half to go work on this company. But, I want to get your thoughts. I mean, looking, yes, inside we're here, Minnesota and in the U.S., but how are other countries doing it, and why are they being so successful? Maybe we can kind of learn from some of those examples. I don't know. Maybe Mudit, you want to take that first, and others, because you and I talked.
Yeah, I mean, I have direct experience with Ireland because, I think, Jim, you mentioned about Ireland, Israel, and China. No experience with China at all. Israel, obviously, at J&J, we were very closely, tied with Biosense Webster, so a lot of activity there with J&J. But as a private venture fund, Irish government was an investor in our fund. And it is amazing what Ireland has done. I mean, one is, again, very, very deep focus on medtech and biopharma. Those are two besides tech. Yeah. And what they have done is, and this is, again, one of my pet peeves with the state of Minnesota in general, they actually created a separate pool of capital, meaningful pool of capital, which was dedicated to funds and activities that lead directly to specific industry, job creation, and company creation. I can't get a call back from State of Minnesota Investment Board. I'm not kidding, but again, having invested more than $300 million in this economy, having created more than 2,000 jobs in this economy, I can't get a call back. Ireland, on the other hand, wrote a check for us.
Wrote a check and a Guinness.
And I'm not a beer drinker, but still, I'm not a beer drinker. And the weather is, they always say, oh, the Irish weather is so mild. What they forget to tell you, that gray is very severe. So they always compare themselves to Minnesota. Oh, that weather is this, and oh yeah, your gray is not that great either. But they really have made a concerted effort, and it's again, I think if you look at, I mean, we have all those elements here. Minnesota is a great, by the way. Again, when I said coastal validation, that wasn't a positive. That's more that we have so much going on here, and we still seek coastal validation. It's amazing. This is a place for anything electrical. When it comes to medical devices, there's nothing much. Somebody said Massachusetts. I can't find a single investment in Massachusetts today in MedTech, to be honest. It's California, Minnesota, some North Carolina maybe. So we actually have an amazing ecosystem here. But I think learnings from places like Ireland are that they really, again, I'm a capitalist, so I always believe capital is one of the key elements to develop an ecosystem. The country got behind it, put meaningful dollars, and those dollars are now starting to pay dividend because, and again, their skill set is slightly different. They're more vascular, so it's more plumbing side of things, which is less smart, like what we have here, which is all electrical and the smarts. So, but they are very good at that, and they are becoming, and Medtronic having a big presence there helped them. So they anchored the big industry there with the manufacturing, and then evolving from manufacturing to R&D and moving up the food chain.
I just want to add one comment. The really fascinating thing about Ireland, if you went back to mid-90s to like 2002, 2003, Minnesota net exported medical devices to Ireland. Around 2004, it started to flip, and we now net import medical devices from Ireland. They have had a sustained, we talked about that, 30 or now close to 40-year investment in building their industry. And Woody, you just said it right at the end. It's gone from, it was manufacturing of someone else's product to now inventing their own devices, commercializing them, and bringing to market, to the point of we're now seeing Irish companies do economic development projects in the U.S.
Especially Mayo.
Yeah.
I think just ease of doing business is an advantage outside of the U.S., whether it's clinical trial access, regulatory environment, just getting things done more quickly is an advantage. I think in a lot of states, Ohio included, it's complicated to do business. It's hard for a med tech company to build a relationship with the Ohio State University. Maybe you have a good meeting with the CEO of an institution, but by the time you get down to the procurement manager that may or may not endorse you're a year down the road. So it's just, the more that, because I think we're trying to say that it's not all about the money, although I think we're kind of, ease of doing business, I think, and accessibility is a way to build a healthy ecosystem without having to maybe invest as much as you would think.
Maybe I'm going to shift this a little bit here to another stream of questioning that was touched upon. There's competition. There's unique strategies that different regions have. And same thing, we talked about Mayo also. There are a lot of IP generation and ideas. But in the end, there's a few places that might end up having all the different components. But, it may not, for many places, it may not be. And there's really unique things at each place. So how do we think of more creative ways to collaborate? That was the first topic earlier on, but really collaborate with these different regions, considering there is so much competition, right? And even across globally. What's your thoughts on that? We can start maybe Eddie and Joni, because you're both dealing with those things, but if I'd want to chime in.
Sure. I think we have a big opportunity is the Midwest to be a little bit more proactive, confident in the good science that is occurring within the states. In Ohio, our organization has started to share what we call a member investor portfolio update. It's basically a catalog of achievements that are occurring within the companies in Ohio, and we're trying to share that as broadly as possible. Some other states now have adopted that report, and I didn't fully appreciate how important it is to share stories. And here's what's happening. The amount of times I've been in a conversation with people outside of Ohio who, and I'm sure this is the case in Minnesota, I didn't realize that was happening here. I didn't know that they were there. I didn't know that that facility was there. I didn't know Ohio State University had a medical center. I mean, it's crazy the amount of things that you hear in the overall sort of just ignorance to the amount of talent and capabilities that exist in the Midwest. So us building a stronger coalition of sharing stories about medtech success, life sciences success in the Midwest, I think could serve us all well.
And I think, with Eddie's organization and ours, we're part of the Midwest Council of State of Biotech Associations, and we get together once a year, our own selves, and we try to find ways that in the Midwest, I think there's 11 different states, how can we collaborate and help each other? One example is we partnered with G2G Consulting, and all of our states now have access, our members, have access to some of the webinars that they have and like VIP type reporting. So I think that's important, but I'd love to be able to have this conversation further. I think if there's ways that we can, tap into this. I know you're a Minnesota fund, but if there's other ways that we can find funding that you guys might have here, especially in the med tech, that our companies might be able to leverage. Any workforce development programs that might make sense for us to collaborate on. I really hope we can continue that conversation because I think there's things that we can all help each other with. We can fill some of the gaps that you guys might have and vice versa. So I think this isn't to be determined conversation, but I'm hopeful that we can come back on the stage again and say, this is what we've done, this is how we've been able to partner, so.
Yeah. It's hard, right? Like, in Minnesota, I've been in Rochester my entire professional career. I grew up in the Twin Cities, but that regionalism is really strong, and there's decades.
Not with Mayo in Minnesota.
Decades. No, not at all. But there's decades of history of we're competing for workforce, we're competing for patients, we're competing for technologies. And you have to have enough ego to set aside your ego to be able to, right? And so there's this really, it's threading the needle of cooperation, but also competition that happens within a geography, say the Twin Cities. So it's happening within the Twin Cities, and then it happens between the Twin Cities and Rochester. It happens within Rochester. So there's these layers of competition that also require collaboration. And it requires understanding one's strengths, acknowledging one's gaps, and finding where the incentives are aligned and the mission is aligned. And so the challenge around MedTech 3.0, Minnesota MedTech 3.0, is finding that sweet spot between all of these entities that are normally competing within private industry and outside of, like finding that sweet spot. And it's going to take time to build the trust to make it happen.
I would also add to that, collaboration is clunky, and there's really no other way to put it. And so if you go into it with the thought that you're going to get it right or perfect on the first go, like you're going to be sorely disappointed. And so very much like we're trying to create ecosystems that are risk tolerant and champion people for kind of putting it out there. Like as you're building ecosystems, you also have to reflect that. And like go into it with good faith, make sure you find partners who you can trust. So when you do get a little bit of egg on your face, you can quickly pivot and then learn from that and then rebuild and reiterate because you're not going to get it right at first. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Like you got to start trying.
And actually, I wanted to ask Mickayla a question because, as we're talking about this, what I was interested about your fund, Group Capital, is that it's actually quite broad. You cover fintech, ag, medtech, biotech, I think automotive, a lot of sectors. What are you seeing in these other fields, right? I mean, we're talking about medtech here and biotech, but what's happening there? Because I think that might shed some light too on what other sectors are doing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as with anything, like you can find good models of success in other industries, other markets, other geographies. I would probably look at the Michigan and Detroit market and their work around mobility. They've done a really good job of reinventing themselves. So, of course, we know traditionally Detroit was known for auto manufacturing. If you go there now, they have totally pivoted and reframed their entire ecosystem around mobility with some massive public-private partnership dollars to make that a reality, building out shared resources, shared spaces, very similar to what Jim mentioned with the MedTech 3.0. So there's good examples of that, or even closer neighbors in Grand Forks, North Dakota with Grand Sky. I think this was a really interesting initiative back in 2015 or so. The local community had a really strong aviation kind of culture, but kind of looking ahead at where the future was going, it was gearing up to be unmanned aircraft, space and sensors, all that good stuff. And so they put together a public-private partnership to establish a test park. And that test park now attracts global companies who want to enter the US market and use this as a beachhead for all of their UAS kind of flying. Wow. And so I think there's really good examples of kind of the common themes that come up in all of these robust ecosystems, is a lot of what we've already kind of touched on here.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Frank, do you want to take the last question to give? We've got 2 minutes here.
Oh,
quick. Or do you want to give an overview maybe?
Well, I think the last question, that's just for everyone. We were very intentional in saying, hey, it's not just about the money, and it was sort of to force ourselves to not have a conversation for an hour just about dollars, but we know it is important. And so I might ask for each of you to just take in what we've discussed today. What's your sense of what are we doing or what should we be doing in order to create more robust capital markets for innovation? And that could mean startups, but I mean that as innovation because it's not only new venture creation where we're seeing the need for investments has been highlighted here. And so maybe just go right down.
Sure. My response is going to be mirroring kind of the piece of like our little part of the puzzle, which is the early stage. So for us, a lot of it is bringing more awareness to this asset class. Midwesterners are not all that familiar with venture capital. You get to other markets and it's kind of, the way it's socialized is so like it's a no-brainer. But I think where we've kind of fallen short from an ecosystem is we talk to a bunch of fiscally conservative Midwesterners about a high-risk asset class, and we just talk about risk and return. And we will lose them, and we have traditionally lost them time and time again. What I have found to be successful, and we've kind of built this into all of our cohorts and all of our kind of development, is really understanding the other motivating factors that really end up driving people to invest. So this is things like investing locally or being at the cutting edge, really tying kind of their legacy to the things that they're investing in. And that's not to say that they're not doing it for returns, but generally speaking, when you're talking to a conservative Midwest group, that's kind of pulling on the heartstrings, and that's why kind of device and healthcare in general is a really great kind of access point into it, because it tells a really clear and great story as to why those early investment dollars are so critical. But all of what I've been focused on is pulling in and educating and more awareness to the earliest stage. So then hopefully those companies can grow and be passed on to other folks to be invested in at later stages.
I would just pick up on something that Chris was getting into, which is just setting some priorities and highlighting true assets and capabilities that a particular institution or region has. And I say that, and I'll add that maybe bringing in a third party to sort of say that for you. So for example, given that I worked in a university for a while, they're often asked, well, what are the 5 things that University of Minnesota or Ohio State is really good at? Well, as soon as the president or a leader there says those 5, he or she will have hell to pay from the rest of the university saying, well, what do you mean? We're doing good
From
stuff
the other
too.
15.
So it's maybe an organization like ours could come and say, well, we know that Ohio State is really good at X, Y, and Z, and promote that and allow people to really understand what that means. I'd say the same thing at the state level for investments. One thing that we do bad in Ohio is we want everyone to be a winner. So I mentioned the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati and the investments that have been made in those 3 cities. It becomes diluted. So we don't pick a winner. As soon as we make an investment in those 3 cities, Toledo and Athens and Dayton say, well, what about us? And so you end up diluting what could be transformational investments. And again, it's very hard, but again, maybe bringing in a third party to say, here are the things that your state's really good at, here's what your universities are good at, and using others to sort of communicate that to attract those investments.
It's helpful, yeah. Mudit?
Yeah, so for me at a tactical level, I mean, it's very simple-minded, but capital, talent, and opportunities. It's a vicious circle, isn't it? It's a positive feedback that feeds each other. So capital is as important as talent, and talent is as important to create opportunities. Those opportunities do more capital, that feeds more talent, so that cycle goes on. So that's how I look at it in a very simplistic way. So capital is very important.
Well, I think that we've mentioned it before, how siloed we can be, both at the university level and in each of our states. So I think if we really want to do something regional, as we're suggesting and collaborating, I think it's getting the people together that we want to identify together to say, do we want to do this? If so, what can it be? Kind of like to Chris's point, it's not going to be easy because there's a lot of competition, but what can we do together that makes us stronger? What assets do we have in each of our states that we can use and leverage, that we can attract those investments, attract that talent, rather than just this is what Minnesota's doing, this is what Twin Cities are doing. Like there's a lot of things besides med device that are happening outside of Minnesota. So I think, if we really want to do this, I would challenge all of us here to say, let's get together and put something together.
Yeah, thank you. Chris?
I think, so first, be inclusive as how we define a win. If it's an inventor who hands off to a management team, if it's an early stage management team that has an early acquisition, if it's a unicorn, whatever it is, understand how you want to define the wins, and then tell those stories over and over and over, as loudly as you can, as broadly as you can. If you want to attract capital, you want to convey a sense of this is a safe place for something to get moved ahead, you have to tell this. We have the wins, we don't tell the stories of the wins. We need to do more of that.
Yeah,
a lot more of that.
That's a good point, yeah. Well, I think with that, I know we're a little bit over here, but we thank you for your attention and listening. I hope it was insightful. And I want to thank the panelists and, of course, my co-moderator. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the break after that.